Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 38. I am the show's host, Kyle, and today is going to be a mostly current events news stories today, but I do want to start off by making just kind of a cool announcement to my audience. Myself and Will Porter put together an article on Mosul titled Mosul, What You Need to Know, that's currently running on the Libertarian Institute. We got some pretty cool quotes for the article. We took all the relevant information, everything you'll need to know on Mosul, put it into this article, so it's a pretty easy read. It's not super long. It mostly tackles current event stuff, but it gives you all the background information you need to know to make the current events make sense. Obviously, we're in a situation in Mosul where we're supporting Iranian Bashia militias, and in Syria, right across the imaginary border. So on the, I guess that would be the eastern side of the ISIS state, we are fighting with Iran, and on the western side of the Islamic State, we are fighting against Iran. And so just when you have things like that going on in any of these situations, it's always, it takes a lot of background to actually understand what's happening. So I think me and Will do a pretty good job in that article of explaining it, and Will really did an awesome job, did most of the writing, and is a great journalist. He is currently writing at the Daily Sheeple. I will make sure, I'm not sure if he has an author page or an author bio page up there yet, but I will make sure to link to either his bio on that or at the Libertarian Institute. I am hoping to have Will on the show hopefully sometime next week. We'll do a show mainly talking about the article we put out, but also talking about maybe some other current event stuff. Will's pretty sharp and up to date on everything. He's writing quite a few articles a week over at the Daily Sheeple. Really good stuff on foreign policy events if you're interested. So, technology permitting, hopefully we have that show for you next week. And like I said, hopefully everybody goes to Libertarian Institute and checks out the article. That's libertarianinstitute.org. I believe we're actually, if you go to the Libertarian Institute today, it's May 10th, 2017, we are the first article on the page there. So, that's pretty cool. All right, now to get into the news. Let's start with U.S. soldiers being on the front lines. We have a report out of the Pentagon suggesting that the U.S. should look at moving U.S. soldiers closer to the front lines in Afghanistan. Of course, we've already seen this happen in the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and as a result of that, we have seen a few more U.S. deaths under Trump than under Obama, and they seem to be accelerating since U.S. soldiers were put closer to the front lines. I think this is probably uniquely dangerous in Afghanistan compared to Iraq or Syria. From what I understand and from what I read, I don't hear a lot about the Iraqi government's army or the Kurdish YPG being heavily infiltrated with enemies, so members of ISIS, and so you don't have situations where a YPG member who is actually a member of ISIS walks into a YPG camp undercover and ends up blowing himself up or shooting up a training facility, which seems to happen a lot in Afghanistan. Likewise, you don't see that happening much with the Iraqi army out. I mean, there may be a few incidences of this going on. I think this maybe happened when ISIS was rising, but since I haven't seen many stories about it since really the rise of ISIS, definitely not in 2016 or 2017. But in Afghan, I would say at least 5 to 6 times a year there's a major situation where at least over five Iraqi soldiers will end up being killed either by a undercover Taliban member or ISIS member infiltrates the Afghan police forces, and then will either let in other members of the Taliban or just detonate a suicide bomb in the middle of a training facility. Things like this happen all the time in Afghanistan. So the more forward U.S. troops are deployed, you would think the more U.S. troops would be vulnerable to this situation where a U.S. troop could be standing next to an Afghan police member, but in reality that's not an Afghan police member, that's a ISIS fighter who could just pull out a gun and shoot the U.S. troop in the back. And it seems like such a vulnerable position to put our troops in when we can't guarantee the forces they're fighting with are not undercover ISIS or Taliban members. Then you're putting the troops in a really dangerous situation. You should be asking yourself from a practical standpoint, does this sound like a good idea? I think this probably also gives some indication into how weak the Afghani armed forces are, that they're really losing the battle to the Taliban. The Taliban take more and more ground every year from the Afghani government that's really backed by the U.S. Right now, I think we have 8,000-ish troops in Afghanistan with more on the way, and this isn't even enough to keep the Taliban from gaining ground. 8,000 U.S. troops isn't sufficient to keep the Taliban at bay, so From a practical standpoint, with all the contractors over there, there's probably 40,000 or so something U.S. Armed personnel in Afghanistan, and that's not enough. And so you have to ask yourself, what number would be enough? How many U.S. soldiers have to be fighting against the Taliban at all times? This isn't just, to prevent the rise of the Taliban or to kick them out of Kabul like we did in 2001. This is how many U.S. Security forces have to be on the ground. I think you're looking at in all reality, it may be 100,000. We may have to commit 100,000 American lives to being in Afghanistan at all times to prevent the rise of the Taliban. And man, is it worth it? And would the U.S. government, and as an American, we really should be asking ourselves, and this is the numbers the government should be giving us, so we have the information. Our congressman should tell us, hey, listen, if you want to occupy Afghanistan for whatever reason to prevent anybody from attacking the U.S., it's going to require 100,000 armed Americans in Afghanistan at all times, and maybe that's enough, maybe that's not. I'm just guessing based on the levels of troops we have there now. And so it seems to me that the American people would probably likely make the conclusion that, hell no, it's not worth it. But when we think that we're controlling Afghanistan, when really the U.S. government and the Afghan government only control 50% or so of the country, and that's with all the armed contractors, 40,000 or so Americans in the country. And so, like I said, the numbers just don't line up. And from a practical standpoint, it's just showing that how much the U.S. has to commit to stop the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Counterinsurgencies are hard work, and they drain the blood of the empires, and that's exactly what the U.S. is facing now. And we could save our country. We can really prevent an economic collapse, or at least lessen the impacts of an economic collapse, if we just brought all of our troops home and realized how stupid this empire building is, and what possible reason could the U.S. have to continue to think that we need to have forward deployed thousands and thousands of Americans in Afghanistan. It's only going to create more hostilities between the U.S. and the people of Afghanistan. I'm sure it rallies support towards the Taliban because more infiltrators are now in the country. This is certainly the perspective of the Afghani people. And while some people, I'm sure, like the U.S. troops there, either because for crony reasons they get, financial gain, or if it's just because, they share the values that the people who support the U.S. troops share, and so they benefit. But as a whole of the country obviously doesn't support the American occupation there, and the Taliban are very strong because of it. I also read a story out of, I believe, International Business Times, but it may have been a different source. Anyway, the story was that the U.S. troop who died in Somalia was on the front lines at the time when he died. And so here again we have a situation where U.S. troops' lives are seemingly put at risk for absolutely no reason. And what interest could the U.S. have in Somalia? What benefit could it be for the U.S. to kill some guy running around Somalia? No matter how many terrorists we kill, it's never enough. And so putting the life of another U.S. troop on the front lines in Somalia is something that Donald Trump and the current Pentagon are willing to do. I'm sure Obama did it as well. And so it's not that I'm just trying to pick on Trump. I'm just saying this is this very stupid thing that he's doing, and that as Americans we should all be appalled. And if you're not American, obviously you're upset because I'm sure the U.S. has done something to your country on the international stage. And largely, what I said before goes with Somalia. There's really not a strong government there. I don't think the military is super tight in its ranks. I don't know if even U.S. news outlets would run stories if Al-Shabaab member infiltrated the Somali army and killed a bunch of people. But I gotta say, I haven't heard those stories coming out of Somalia. However, the U.S. Special Operations soldier who died in Somalia is proof that if you forward deploy U.S. troops, if you put them on the front lines in Somalia, they're going to end up dying because there's just way too many Al-Shabaab members. There's way too many people who don't want Americans in Somalia there, and they're going to be able to inflict casualties on the American troops. And that's very unfortunate that Somalia has to be in that state. I would certainly rather Somalia be, a thriving country where the people had rights and that jihadists didn't run around all the time. But at some point, the Americans had to realize there's nothing we could do about it. We've been trying since 2001, even before. Black Hawk Down was under Clinton. And so after all these years, we just can't realize the futility of our efforts, and we can't realize what damage it's doing to the country at home. It is really is sad because it's destroying the American country. It's having such negative impacts on the American people. So Trump is likely to continue that bad policy, and he may be picking up another one. The spending bill that went through, I don't like that spending bill, but it did have one decent provision, and that was it didn't grant any more funding to send additional detainees to Guantanamo Bay, so that's good, right? Congress doesn't want to torture people anymore. Awesome. But Trump, in his signing statement, said that he can still send detainees to Guantanamo Bay, so I mean, first, this doesn't surprise me. I think this is well within the presidential power that Trump and that Obama and Bush used. That by deliberately going against this one provision of the bill really isn't anything out of the ordinary. And I'm sure that Obama and Bush both secretly funded different operations or different wars or just anything maybe that the American people would have opposed in what Congress had to say they opposed but allowed the president to do undercover. I'm sure there was spying operations under Obama, drone programs under Obama, bombing of Syria under Obama and Bush, the torture program and other things where there's no explicit congressional funding giving to it, and even sometimes explicit law saying that you can't do it, like against torture. But the president is able to fund and do these things anyways because that's just the extent of the American power. The power of the American presidency. And so, I mean, I'm sure Trump is well within what Bush and Obama did on this. However, it just goes to show that he's not principled and not good on really any issues. One of the things that was actually really bad about his campaign on the foreign policy stage was his commitment to torture, where Hillary Clinton was actually better than Trump. I guess that's the way I should phrase it. This was one of the few foreign policy issues where Hillary Clinton was actually better than Trump was on the torture issue. But then when he appointed Mattis, it seemed like he had gained some reality and insight on the issue and was like, we probably shouldn't be torturing people. It may not work that well. That's what Mattis tells me. So I kind of believe that. But this signing statement would suggest that either somebody else has Trump's ear at this moment, or Trump is just unprincipled flip-flopper, and somebody told him, hey, say this in your signing statement, and so Trump did, and I'm sure this is, good propaganda for the terrorists, and it's bad because a country that tortures obviously has moral defaults and distorts the... We also have seen an increase in spending on space-based weapons. This has been a little bit of a story because after a 2-year light seeker project by the Air Force, we had some space plane touching down, so this has been a big story. Obviously, I talked about last time just how out of control Pentagon's budget is and how much we spend on the military and how it's actually $250 billion more than what we think, and I'm sure a lot of this funding is hidden in some other budget, so it doesn't look like it's Pentagon spending, but it really is because it's all weapons spending. Moving overseas, we have elections in South Korea. These elections seem to be overshadowed by the French elections, but they probably are even maybe more important to the U.S. with the current hostilities towards towards North Korea, not towards France. The elections occurred after the previous South Korean president was impeached. There was a lot of corruption going on. I think it's pretty obvious, and the woman may even face jail time for it. And so they held like special elections. Both of the top two candidates were much more dovish on North Korea than the previous administration was. And I think even the more dovish of the candidates actually won the election. I have no idea about his politics. All I know is that he doesn't hate North Korea as much as the previous administration does, and is looking to maybe reinstate some kind of sunshine policy, which was the coming together of the two Koreas, and not necessarily forming one country, but easing hostilities and all the intentions between the two countries. And so one of the first things he says, I want to ease hostility, the hostile tensions with North Korea. That sounds really good to me. It'll be interesting to see what happens between this government and the U.S. government, because this is obviously anti what the U.S. wants to do. However, the majority of the reason that the U.S. is so active and aggressive towards North Korea is because we need to protect our ally South Korea. And if South Korea is saying, hey, USA, please don't do this, then it creates kind of an awkward situation for the United States and the president. Of course, previous presidents have certainly ignored the will of the people they were bombing, the Libyans, the Yemenis, the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Afghanis, all these people didn't want to be bombed by the U.S., but the U.S. bombed them anyways, for their own good. However, the South Koreans play a much larger role on the international stage, and so hopefully this does have a result of tension and ratcheting down between the two countries. The president also talked about how U.S. Missile defense systems being installed in South Korea was creating tensions with China, and how he was opposed to that and wanted to look for a resolution to that. So maybe they'll take the missile defense systems out of the country. That would certainly be an interesting development. I think in a lot of ways, South Korea is kind of stuck with the U.S. as an ally. I think that for the large part, South Korea has allowed the U.S. to subsidize its military and defense capabilities and is really pit to fight with its neighbor in North Korea. And the North Koreans have certainly been aggressive toward the South Koreans too, don't get me wrong, but I think that the South Koreans definitely rely on the U.S. for security, and so at the end of the day, maybe Trump will be able to say, sorry, but you gotta do it our way. And we may not see any benefits, but it's always good when the people let the dove over a hawk. I touched on West Africa last time, but I just wanted to get into it a little bit more this time. The big news is that there has been a 5-country coalition formed, and they're going to have 15,000 international troops to fight against this force. The countries in that coalition will be Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and one additional country. They're going to try to have some pretty heavy weaponry. I'm not sure exactly what kind of Islamists they're fighting. I think they're largely just rebels who happen to be Sunni, either extremist or Muslim Brotherhood types fighting against the government. Of course, this all started after the U.S. invaded Libya. One of the effects of the U.S. invading Libya was that there were a bunch of people known as the Tuaregs. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Forgive me if I'm incorrect. Those people then were brought to Libya by Gaddafi, but that wasn't kind of the ethnic region that they were from, and that was in Mali, and so they went back to Mali, and the Tuareg people in Mali were being oppressed, and so then they started a rebellion against the government, and then Islamists from Libya came to Mali and kind of hijacked that war and hijacked that movement and turned it into an Islamist movement. And so now we have a bunch of terrorists running around Mali in the name of the Tuareg revolution because of the U.S. intervention in Libya. It's always so hard to know what ripple effects U.S. interventions will have in the Middle East, but you'll know that there will all be tidal waves that just come and destroy other countries in the region. It's never democracy spreading through the Middle East. It's always war spreading through the Middle East. Another story coming out of Mali is that 15 Malian soldiers have been killed by Islamists in the past week, and so I think this just goes to show the hostilities, why Mali probably is pushing for this coalition to form, and just that these Islamists are there, they're running around, they're a real problem. Third story out of Afghanistan would be that 4 UN peacekeepers, all from African countries, were killed in the Central African Republic fighting against a Christian extremist group, apparently. Not too much information on this one, it just goes to show the kind of, the instability in Africa and around the world, and how US bombs never fix it. In Iraq, we have reports that Iraqi forces are continuing to make very small gains against the ISIS fighters in Mosul. I always hear how many thousands of ISIS fighters that the U.S. kills and how many thousands are left, but it never seems that they make all that much progress for the number of ISIS fighters they're killing. So anytime you're listening to the news and you hear the U.S. killed another 25 ISIS fighters, I have a feeling they're killing an awful lot of male civilians and just labeling them as ISIS fighters. And, if there's a bunch of male citizens in the area, they're probably getting bombed and just labeled ISIS, because it seems like they bombed more ISIS fighters than they had initially predicted were in Mosul. So I guess the Iraqi army also changed their strategy a little bit. They opened up another front in the northwest of Mosul, and they've been moving into neighborhoods from that direction as well. They say they have all exits cleared, and that ISIS is now trying to sneak out of Mosul, embedded with refugees. Of course, this is going to cause the problem that now refugees are going to start to be harassed, tortured, probably extrajudicial killings will occur, as probably biased judges and military tribunals determine that people are guilty. If they're lucky enough to have military tribunals, I mean, maybe a soldier will just say, oh, I know you're in ISIS and shoot you, and that, no justice will ever happen. So Mosul is likely going to be a mess. But as I said before, we will be speaking more about Mosul when I have Will on the show. In Syria, we have news saying that Trump is going to increase arms to the Kurds. In the past, the U.S. has been pretty limited in the arms that's supplied to the Kurds, especially Syrian Kurdish forces, the YPG forces. This, of course, is causing huge problems with the U.S. ally Turkey, who has warned the U.S. several times not to do this. One of the things happening is that the U.S. said that the YPG will return the weapons after ISIS is defeated. I really doubt this will happen. I almost could guarantee that at some point, one of these weapons is going to be used to kill a Turkish soldier, and at that point, Erdogan's going to have real problems with the United States. He is already normalizing relations with Russia, so we'll see what happens there. Some of the possible weapons the U.S. may be shipping to the Kurds would be 120mm mortars, machine guns, ammunition, and light armored vehicles. They did say they wouldn't provide surface-to-air missiles. However, from the perspective of Turkey, this is a terrorist organization, so this is the U.S. Army terrorists, and that's certainly going to make Erdogan very mad, and you have to wonder what is going to be the result of the result in the relationship between Erdogan and the United States. I think it's very possible that this could really drive a wedge between Turkey and the U.S., Turkey and NATO as well. I have to find somebody who has some insight on if Turkey would ever leave NATO and what that would look like. It does seem that Turkey, we do know that Turkey is looking to reestablish relations with Russia and normalize those relations, and I believe Putin said that it's complete. So we're looking at a situation where Turkey could certainly move towards Russia, and that there isn't the barrier still from the shoot down of the Russian plane by Turkey. And what would happen in that case? It does seem like that would have other repercussions for Turkey. They certainly have a seeming alliance with Saudi Arabia and Israel, although Erdogan was very critical of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians in a speech recently, where he said, the Israelis treat the Palestinians very poorly. Turkey fired back by saying, well, you treat some of your civilians poorly too, obviously referring to the Kurds, who Erdogan treats as second-class citizens. I don't know if I can honestly say which group is treated worse, Turkish Kurds or Palestinians in Israel, but both countries treat both groups very poorly, wage wars against them, bomb them, and it's a real bad situation for those groups. So neither side has any room to talk. However, they're government, so they are going to talk about each other. And this, I guess this could be another sign that Turkey maybe is looking to move towards Russia, divide itself, and cut itself off from a state like Israel. Of course, Russia has a seeming alliance with Iran, and so what would happen between Turkey and Iran? There's certainly been hostilities there in the past. However, while Erdogan is a Sunni and Turkey is a Sunni majority state, it does seem like the relations between those two countries haven't been as bad as, for instance, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So, I mean, there's a lot of geopolitics going on here, and I hope I'm explaining this all well, but Turkey is in the center of some very important alliances: NATO, the U.S. alliance between Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S., and then the Russia alliance with Iran and Turkey moving towards Iran. So, I mean, tons of moving parts here. Final story I want to talk about today is that there's been a return in piracy in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. This is, of course, the land or the water area between Somalia and Yemen, in both countries where the U.S. has been a large destabilizing force. In Yemen, of course, we're helping Saudi Arabia wage a war that's starving, creating a famine, and is slaughtering the civilians of Yemen, completely destabilizing the region and destroying the country. Of course, the U.S. already managed to accomplish that in Somalia by teaming up with the Kenyans and the Ethiopians to go in there and sap that country, as well as our drone bombs going off in both countries and counter-terrorism wars wars that we've waged in both countries since 2001 has destabilized the region so much that pirates go out on the high seas and try to take over boats. I guess there's been 6 incidences in the past couple of months, and so it's a rather disturbing trend because there is a lot of oil that flows through the region. It is a very important shipping lane, and any disruption in those shipments could certainly cause more problems for the people of Somalia and Yemen, both of whom are facing famine conditions. And so I should probably do a show or something where I kind of compare the two countries, Somalia and Yemen, just how the U.S. wars have devastated both countries, and how both countries are just such classic examples of the failures of U.S. interventionism, and how when we have U.S. interventionism, things get worse in countries. All right, that'll wrap up my show for today. I hope everybody's enjoying the show. Again, if you like the show and like what I'm doing, you should really check out my article at libertarianinstitute.org. Join the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. I'm in that group. The co-author of my article, Will Porter's in that group, as well as a few other people who really like to share their thoughts and current events, foreign policy stories. You can follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE. I post a news roundup every day on my website, kylesfilesblog.com, and on the Libertarian Institute, so you check out those websites for that. I also send out my news roundups in an email, so if anybody's interested in just getting news emailed to you every morning, check out my website and then sign up for the email list there. And I think that's for all I got for you guys today, so thanks so much, and I will see you on Friday.